Hello those new to my channel and returning Macabros, and welcome to my latest series entitled The Craft Of, which will serve as a crash course on traditional 3-act structure, which is the script structure that the vast majority of Hollywood films released over the last God knows how many decades have utilized. If you haven't checked out the first video in this series, I would recommend doing so as it gives a more broad overview of 3-act structure as a whole. Today, we're going to specifically discuss the first of the 5 major plot points I went over, the inciting incident. The inciting incident is the moment where your main character's way of life is disturbed in some way. Some out of the ordinary is thrust into their situation, often resulting in the character making a decision in regard to confronting it, which serves as the first act turn. Obviously, before we can show how a particular character's life is being upended by the inciting incident, we first need to establish their status quo. Let's take Dodgeball, a true underdog story, as a clear and basic example. The film begins with establishing the life of Peter LaFleur, a young, disciplined, ambitious entrepreneur and owner of the aptly named Average Joe's Gym. We get a sense of his laid-back and menial existence and meet his gaggle of quirky yet lovable friends. The script even has Peter sum up the entire essence of his character in a single sentence later on in the film.
I found that if you have a goal, that you might not reach it. But if you don't have one, then you are never disappointed. And I gotta tell you, it feels phenomenal.
But then we come to the inciting incident. Peter learns that his gym is in foreclosure and he has 30 days to come up with $50,000 or the gym will be torn down and developed into a parking lot for the rivaling Globo Gym. Now, while some may write off Dodgeball as just a goofy comedy, the writing is actually pretty solid, especially in terms of its inciting incident. While the setup may seem stark and simple, well, it is. And this is the point. A lot of writers tend to overthink the inciting incident, when sometimes a basic, crystal clear setup is the best way to go. The inciting incident in this case is actually doing multiple things at once. 1, it establishes the stakes. We know if Peter isn't able to come up with the money, he will lose his gym and he and his friends will be left out in the cold. 2, it establishes a clear goal. While Peter and his bros don't end up deciding on playing dodgeball to raise the money until a little later, we know exactly what their ultimate goal is: to raise $50,000 and save Average Joe's. And 3, it establishes a time constraint, something that is very common and useful in a lot of films. If Catherine told Peter that he could refinance and buy himself another 9 months to come up with the money, well, doesn't really have the same sense of urgency, does it? But in the film, he has 30 days, a simple but effective way to add tension to the plot. Some of you may be rolling your eyes as what I am discussing sounds so by the book, but something doesn't have to be complicated to be effective. You'd be amazed how many amateur screenplays that I've read that, regardless of how interesting their premise may be, don't even manage to do, over the course of the entire run of the story, establish clear stakes, a specific goal, and a sense of urgency, what Dodgeball does in just under 9 minutes. While it may seem a bit elementary, when in doubt, sometimes sticking with the basics is the best way to go. So again, we establish our protagonist's way of life. The inciting incident disturbs that way of life. However, despite Dodgeball being so effective in its simplicity, this doesn't mean that all films have to do all that Dodgeball does with their inciting incident in order to be effective. 2003's Oldboy tells the story of Ode Sue, a drunken womanizer who is kidnapped and held prisoner in a surreal hotel room/prison for 15 years, until he is suddenly released and sets out to discover who imprisoned him and why. The film begins by quickly setting up Ode Sue as a boozy buffoon, and then immediately shit pops off when he is captured and imprisoned. So in this case, you can see that the 3 elements that Dodgeball established with its inciting incident aren't all that clear. Despite how the inciting incident is clearly a disturbance in Ode Sue's life, we don't really know what's going on, and thus the stakes, goal, and/or any time constraints aren't all that evident. However, despite this, Oldboy does something just as effective, namely making the audience collectively scream, "What the ever-loving f***?" The primary aim of the inciting incident, aside from of course showing a disturbance in the protagonist's life, is meant to grab the audience's attention, to kick the story off. In my last video, I spoke of how a lot of screenwriting guides will say things like your inciting incident needs to happen by page 10 or whatever. Now, while I would say setting specific page numbers for plot beats is a fool's gambit, the point is that you want to get to the inciting incident as quickly as possible, within reason of course. You want to set up what you need to set up as efficiently as you can before getting to the inciting incident, which kicks off the main story. The longer it takes to get to the inciting incident, the longer it feels like the story is taking to get to the actual meat and potatoes, the higher the chance of your audience losing interest. Best case scenario, you want to get things moving ASAP. Dodgeball takes about 8 minutes to get to the inciting incident, Oldboy takes 5. Now, while Oldboy's inciting incident doesn't establish the stakes, goal, and time constraints as cut and dry as Dodgeball does, that doesn't mean it isn't doing so implicitly or consequentially. Obviously, once Dae-soo is imprisoned, we the audience are already asking ourselves a number of questions. Who the hell put him here and why, being the big ones of course. And thus, this keeps the audience engaged even though it doesn't establish the parameters of the story as clearly as Dodgeball does. Oldboy uses intrigue to keep the audience's attention instead. Now don't mistake what I am saying. Neither of these approaches is better than the other. It is all about what works best for your particular story. There is another lesson to be learned in highlighting the differences between how Dodgeball and Oldboy go about delivering their inciting incidents. In Dodgeball, the goal and stakes are clearly established, while in Oldboy they are not. So does this mean not every story needs these elements? Hell no. In every story, or perhaps I should say 99.9% of stories, just to be safe like those hand sanitizer commercials do, we need to understand what the main character is trying to do, the goal, and why they need to do it, / what happens if they don't, the stakes. These basically make up the engine that drives pretty much every story ever, regardless of the subject matter. But wait, Oldboy doesn't establish these with the inciting incident, but it does later on. After spending 15 years in captivity, Dae-soo is suddenly released and sets out to discover who imprisoned him with the help of a young woman named Mido. Not long after, Dae-soo is confronted by his kidnapper, Woo-jin, who tells Dae-soo that he has 5 days to discover why he was imprisoned or he will kill Mido. So in this case, we establish the main character's goal shortly after the first act turn, to discover who imprisoned him, but don't establish the stakes and time constraint until about halfway through the film. I know I sound like a broken record by this point, but let me reiterate, this is fine. While the film doesn't establish the goals and stakes right from the get-go, it still establishes them at some point during the film. To go back to what I said in the previous video, a mistake that a lot of new writers make is that they tend to draw inspiration from unconventional films in terms of how they are written or structured, and wish to emulate them without understanding that in order to do so, you need to know the basic, more conventional rules of writing and understand their function. Writer-director Park Chan-wook knows that every story needs to establish the main character's goal and the stakes of the story, and understanding this allowed him to play around with convention and mix up when and where the story does so. Again, in order to break and bend the rules, you need to know what they are and why they were established in the first place. So here we have two films that establish their main character's way of life in a timely fashion, and then have their inciting incident kick off the story. However, in relation to what I said about writers being able to mix and match elements of a story, what if we wanted to say, put the inciting incident at the very beginning of the story, before we even establish who our main character is? This is precisely what 2012's Argo does. The film tells the story of CIA exfiltration expert Tony Mendez, who attempts to exfiltrate 6 Americans from Iran after the nation's US embassy is stormed during the Iranian Revolution. The film opens with a gripping sequence of the embassy being taken over by the revolutionaries and the 6 Americans escaping, hiding at the home of the Canadian ambassador. Shortly after this sequence, we meet Tony and establish both the goals and stakes for Tony and the CIA. Get the 6 out of Iran before the revolutionaries find and kill them. Simple and effective. But wait, we didn't establish Tony as a character before the inciting incident. How do we see it as a disturbance to his life? Again, to go back to the example of Oldboy, while the film doesn't explicitly demonstrate how out of the ordinary this particular situation is, we can sort of pick up on this via other factors. How intense the opening sequence is, the reaction from the other bureaucrats following the incident. So even though it isn't explicitly stated, the audience is still given a sense of how serious this particular situation is. But then there is Tony. Now, while Tony's status quo isn't established established before the inciting incident, we get it sprinkled throughout the rest of the film. We get some scenes showing Tony's personal life, how he seems to be on the out with his wife, and is trying to maintain a relationship with his son. So perhaps we can surmise, despite his competency at his job, he is a rather lackluster family man. This establishing information is required as it sets up Tony's character arc for the film, but the film simply sprinkles it throughout, getting to the meat and potatoes of the story immediately. If the film had opened with 5 or 6 minutes of showing Tony's personal life, it just wouldn't have had the same impact as it does when the film opens right as the embassy is being stormed. So the big lesson in this episode is to not only demonstrate how differently the inciting incident can play out in your story, but that it is totally cool to play around with where and when it occurs and see if doing something different or unconventional may work better. If you have a script you have already written, perhaps think about putting the inciting incident at the very beginning and then on page 5 and then on page 10 or 12. Shuffle it around a bit and see where it flows the best. Or perhaps retain some information from the audience, like Oldboy and Argo do, allowing you to slowly draw the viewers in and keep them engaged, giving them little pieces of information at a time throughout the story. You may be surprised that doing so will lead to your story reaching its full potential. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Craft Of. Next up, we will discuss the first act turn, the plot point where the main character often makes a decision in direct response to the inciting incident that sets them off on their journey for the rest of the story. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, consider supporting me on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.